From the dawn of civilization, humans have gazed into the night sky and wondered what the future might hold. The ancients read the movements of the stars, the whispers of the wind, and the behavior of animals, believing that somewhere in nature's patterns lay the blueprint of tomorrow. For them, prophecy was not merely a prediction, it was a lifeline, a way to prepare for the unknown, and sometimes a message from the divine. The allure of prophecy is universal. Ancient Mesopotamian priests inscribed omens on clay tablets, noting the births of two-headed animals as warnings of political disaster. In the royal courts of Egypt, dreams were interpreted as secret communiques from the gods. In distant China, cracks on tortoise shells were read as maps of fate. Across continents and cultures, a single truth emerges. Humanity is addicted to knowing or believing it knows what comes next. But the greatest fascination lies not in prophecies themselves, but in those rare and unsettling moments when they appear to come true. When words spoken decades, centuries, or even millennia earlier seem to align perfectly with later events, the human mind trembles between awe and suspicion. Did the prophet truly foresee the future? Or have we twisted vague language to fit reality after the fact? The idea of fulfilled prophecy sits at the intersection of faith, history, and probability. On one side are believers who see divine orchestration or extraordinary human insight. On the other are skeptics who see coincidence, selective memory, and the human tendency to connect dots that may not belong together. A prophecy's power often lies in its framing. When the Hebrew prophet Isaiah declared that mighty Babylon would fall and never rise again, it was more than political commentary. It was a challenge to history itself. When the Oracle of Delphi told King Croesus that attacking Persia would destroy a great empire, the statement became an immortal lesson in ambiguity. The empire destroyed was his own. In the modern age, with its data-driven skepticism, we like to believe we have outgrown prophecy. And yet, when a 19th century novel, Futility, eerily mirrors the sinking of the Titanic, or when a long-dead inventor's notebook sketch helicopters and tanks centuries before their invention, our rational defenses falter. This work will not simply list prophecies and declare them fulfilled. Instead, it will approach each case as a detective approaches a crime scene, establishing the context, examining the original words, tracing the historical timeline, and weighing competing explanations. We will move through time, beginning with the thunderous declarations of biblical prophets, stepping into the shadowy chambers of ancient oracles, traversing the Renaissance with its seers and mystics, and finally arriving in the modern world where predictions emerge from science as much as from mysticism. In each case, we will ask, what was actually said or written? What was the historical situation at the time? How closely did later events match the prediction? Could this be coincidence, calculated guesswork, or genuine foresight? By the end, we may not be able to resolve the ultimate mystery, whether prophecy taps into supernatural knowledge or simply the patterns of human thought. But we will have traveled through some of the most remarkable moments in recorded history, when the future seemed to announce itself long before it arrived. Biblical prophecies fulfilled. Babylon shall fall. In the 6th century BCE, Babylon was the jewel of the ancient Near East, a city of soaring walls, bustling markets, and gardens that legend remembers as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Its ziggurats climbed toward the heavens, its gates were plated with dazzling blue glazed bricks, and its ruler, Nebuchadnezzar II, commanded armies that stretched the empire's borders from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. To the outside world, Babylon was invincible. Its walls were said to be so thick that chariots could race atop them. The Euphrates River, flowing through the heart of the city, provided a near-endless water supply. Merchants from across Asia, Africa, and the Mediterranean funneled goods into its markets. To challenge Babylon was to challenge the order of the world, and yet, in the writings of the Hebrew prophet Isaiah, composed more than a century before Babylon's final fall, a chilling prophecy was recorded. Babylon, the jewel of kingdoms, the pride and glory of the Babylonians, will be overthrown by God like Sodom and Gomorrah. She will never be inhabited or lived in through all generations. No nomads will pitch their tents there. No shepherds will rest their flocks there. Isaiah 13:19-20. At the time of writing, such a claim bordered on madness. Babylon's power was unquestioned. For Isaiah's audience, the idea that the empire would vanish from history was unthinkable, much like predicting in our age that New York or Tokyo would one day be abandoned ruins. Isaiah's prophecy must be understood against the backdrop of the late 8th century BCE. The Hebrew kingdoms of Israel and Judah were caught between superpowers, Assyria to the north, Egypt to the south, and the rising Chaldean state that would later dominate Babylon. Isaiah's writings often carried a political as well as theological dimension. His message to the Hebrew people was clear. Earthly empires, no matter how mighty, are temporary. Only the will of God endures. Predicting the fall of Babylon was in part a warning against trusting foreign powers for protection instead of divine guidance. But prophecy is more than political commentary. The language Isaiah used, permanent desolation, abandonment, the inability to be rebuilt, went beyond the usual rhetoric of war. It implied not just defeat but obliteration. Fast forward to the year 539 BCE. The Neo-Babylonian Empire under King Nabonidus faced a new threat, the rising Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great. While Nabonidus was absent from the city, leaving his son Belshazzar to rule, the Persians advanced. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, Cyrus took Babylon not by brute force but by cunning. Diverting the Euphrates River, his troops entered the city through the drained riverbed during a night of festival. The city fell with minimal destruction, certainly not the fiery ruin Isaiah described. Yet over time, Babylon's fate aligned eerily with the prophecy. Though the Persians initially preserved it as a provincial capital, subsequent centuries saw the city decline. Trade routes shifted, political power moved to other cities, and by the 1st century CE, Babylon was largely deserted. The great walls crumbled, the hanging gardens vanished, and the city became a barren archaeological site, exactly as Isaiah had said. No nomads will pitch their tents there. Here lies the heart of the debate. Critics argue that Isaiah's prophecy was recorded or edited after the Persian conquest, making it less a prediction and more a historical note framed as prophecy. Others counter that archaeological evidence shows Babylon's slow decline over centuries, suggesting that the permanent desolation was not immediate, yet nonetheless came to pass. From a purely statistical perspective, predicting the fall of an empire is not extraordinary. All empires eventually fall. What makes Isaiah's claim remarkable is the specificity of permanent abandonment, a rarity in ancient urban history. Cities like Rome, Athens, and Thebes survived multiple conquests. Babylon did not. For believers, this is not coincidence but confirmation. The hand of God guiding history. For skeptics, it is a mix of probability, political insight, and the human tendency to remember hits while forgetting misses. Today, the ruins of Babylon lie near Hilla in modern-day Iraq. Tourists and archaeologists walk among crumbling mud brick walls, reconstructed gates, and empty courtyards. The Euphrates still flows nearby, but the city is silent. Nomads do not camp there, shepherds do not graze their flocks. Whether one sees in this silence the echo of divine prophecy or the inevitable decay of human civilization depends on the lens through which one views history. But the fact remains, words spoken more than 2,500 years ago still resonate every time someone stands before the barren plain where the jewel of kingdoms once glittered. The destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. For the Jewish people of the 1st century CE, the Second Temple in Jerusalem was more than a building. It was the beating heart of their faith, culture, and national identity. Rising above the city on the Temple Mount, its white limestone walls and gilded facade caught the sunlight for miles. Pilgrims streamed in from across the Roman Empire during major festivals. Priests in white robes tended the altar, incense curled into the air, The inner courts echoed with prayers and psalms. It was here, in this sacred space, that Jesus of Nazareth walked with his disciples and made one of the most startling declarations in the Gospels. "Do you see all these great buildings?" Jesus replied. "Not one stone here will be left on another, everyone will be thrown down." Mark 13:2, also Matthew 24:2, Luke 21:6. To his followers, the statement must have seemed unthinkable. The temple was massive and fortified. Roman engineers had helped expand its retaining walls. Some of the foundation stones weighed over 500 tons. The idea that it could be completely dismantled was as improbable as predicting that the pyramids would vanish. The Second Temple had been rebuilt after the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, then magnificently renovated by Herod the Great starting around 20 BCE. By the time of Jesus' ministry, around 2730 CE, it stood as both a religious sanctuary and a political symbol, a reminder that the Jewish people still had their center of worship even under Roman occupation. But tensions between the Jewish population and the Roman authorities were constantly simmering. Rebellion was in the air. In this climate, Jesus' words could be read as both a spiritual warning and a political forecast. 4 decades later, the prophecy met its moment. In 66 CE, Jewish rebels launched a revolt against Rome, sparking the First Jewish-Roman War. The Roman response was swift and brutal. By 70 CE, General Titus, later Emperor Titus, led a massive siege against Jerusalem. The historian Flavius Josephus, an eyewitness to the events, describes famine, infighting within the city, and the eventual Roman breach of the walls. In the chaos, the temple was set ablaze. Gold from the roof and ornaments melted and ran between the stones. Roman soldiers pried them apart to recover the precious metal, fulfilling the image of not one stone left upon another. The destruction was so complete that the temple was never rebuilt. Today, only the western wall part of the temple's retaining structure remains, a sacred site for Jewish prayer and pilgrimage. From a secular historian's point of view, the prediction could have been based on a clear reading of political realities. Rebellions against Rome were almost always crushed, and Jerusalem was a volatile province. Jesus, if politically aware, might have foreseen that such a confrontation would lead to the temple's destruction. From a theological standpoint, the precision is striking. The wording, "not one stone left on another," matches Josephus' descriptions of how the temple was dismantled stone by stone. The event was so pivotal that it reshaped Judaism, which adapted to a world without a central sacrificial system, focusing instead on Torah study and synagogue worship. For nearly 2 millennia, the absence of the temple has been a defining reality of Jewish life. For Christians, the prophecy is often cited as evidence of Jesus' divine foresight. For skeptics, it is a remarkable but explainable alignment of political analysis and historical inevitability. Standing at the Western Wall today, with the Temple Mount above and the golden dome of the rock dominating the skyline, one feels the weight of those ancient words. Whether they were divine revelation, political forecast, or a combination of both, the fact remains: the temple, once the pride of Jerusalem, has never risen again. Ezekiel's vision of Israel's restoration. The year was around 593 BCE. Jerusalem was under threat from the expanding Babylonian Empire, and the first waves of Jewish exiles had already been taken to Babylon. Among them was Ezekiel, a priest turned prophet, living in a foreign land far from the temple he once served. For a people whose identity was tied to their homeland, the exile was more than political defeat, it was spiritual desolation. In Babylon, Ezekiel delivered a series of visions and messages that spoke not only of judgment but also of hope. The most famous of these is found in Ezekiel 37, in a vision that begins with a haunting image. "The hand of the Lord was upon me, and he brought me out in the spirit of the Lord, and set me down in the middle of the valley. It was full of bones." Ezekiel 37:1. In the vision, Ezekiel is led by God through a valley littered with dry human bones, lifeless, scattered, long dead. God asks him, "Son of man, can these bones live?" Ezekiel replies cautiously, "O Lord God, you know." God commands Ezekiel to prophesy over the bones. As he does, the bones begin to rattle and reassemble. Sinews and flesh cover them, and breath enters them, bringing them to life. The interpretation given directly in the text is that the bones represent the whole house of Israel, a nation cut off and hopeless. God promises, I will open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel. Ezekiel 37-12. For the exiles of Ezekiel's day, this was a message of eventual return from Babylonian captivity. But many later interpreters saw it as having a dual meaning, a literal return to the land in the distant future after centuries of dispersion. History unfolded in ways that seem to echo the deeper layers of the prophecy. After the Babylonian exile ended in the 6th century BCE, the Jewish people returned to their land and rebuilt the temple. But centuries later, the Romans destroyed the Second Temple in 70 CE and crushed a final revolt in 135 CE, scattering the Jewish population across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. For nearly 1,900 years, there was no Jewish state in the land of Israel. The people remained a dispersed minority, often facing persecution, pogroms, and exile. And yet, in religious rituals, prayers, and cultural memory, the dream of return never faded. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion declared the establishment of the State of Israel. The announcement came just before the British mandate expired, and it was followed immediately by invasion from neighboring Arab states. Against odds, Israel survived, and the modern Jewish homeland was internationally recognized. For many believers, this moment was the visible fulfillment of Ezekiel's prophecy. A people long considered dry bones, scattered, lifeless as a nation, had been brought back to life in their ancestral land. Photographs of Holocaust survivors arriving in Haifa's port seem to embody the imagery of bones given flesh and breath. From a theological perspective, the return to Israel is seen as divine intervention, an event without parallel in history, where a people retain their identity over millennia and reclaim their ancient homeland. For Jewish and Christian Zionists, Ezekiel 37 reads like a roadmap to the 20th century. Skeptics and secular historians point to political, social, and geopolitical forces, the impact of World War II, international sympathy after the Holocaust, Zionist political organization, and British withdrawal from the region. They argue that while the parallel to Ezekiel is compelling, it is coincidence shaped by human agency. Others take a middle ground, acknowledging that the prophecy could inspire actions that made the event possible. In other words, belief in the prophecy may have helped fulfill it. Unlike many fulfilled prophecies that are frozen in history, Ezekiel's vision continues to unfold in the present. The nation of Israel exists, but questions about its security, future borders, and role in world affairs remain unresolved. To some, this suggests the prophecy's ultimate fulfillment may still lie ahead. To others, it shows how interpretations can evolve with events. Standing on the hills of Jerusalem today, one can see both ancient stones and modern skyscrapers, Hebrew inscriptions on street signs, and the mingling of the old and new. Whether one sees it as divine promise kept or as the result of political determination, the transformation from dry bones to a living nation remains one of the most remarkable stories of the 20th century. The Great Fire of London, 1666. In the mid-17th century, London was a crowded and combustible city. Narrow streets, twisted between rows of timber-framed houses, their upper stories leaning so far toward one another that neighbors could shake hands across the road. The summer of 1666 had been long and dry, leaving the city's wooden structures brittle and ready to burn. Yet, fire alone was not the only thing haunting Londoners' minds. This was a city steeped in religious and political tension. Just 6 years earlier, the monarchy had been restored under King Charles II after decades of civil war and Puritan rule. The wounds of those conflicts had not healed. England had fought 2 recent wars with the Dutch, and fears of Catholic conspiracies simmered beneath the surface. Against this backdrop, prophecy found fertile soil. The number 1666 loomed large in the imagination of the time. To devout Christians, it carried a chilling resonance. The number of the beast from the book of Revelation, 666, was widely associated with the Antichrist and the end times. Pamphlets and sermons warn that the year might bring catastrophe, divine judgment, or the collapse of society. Among the most cited prophetic figures was Nostradamus, the 16th century French astrologer whose cryptic quatrains were interpreted by some as predicting a great fire in the great city in the year of the beast. The vagueness of his verses allowed believers to see in them ominous relevance to London. By the summer of 1666, whispers of impending doom were common in markets, taverns, and churches. Many feared pestilence, others invasion, but fire was the most persistent nightmare. In the early hours of the 2nd of September 1666, that nightmare began to take form. In a bakery on Pudding Lane, a small spark, perhaps from an unattended oven, ignited the wooden building. The flames, fanned by a strong east wind, leapt from house to house, devouring everything in their path. London's firefighting resources were primitive: leather buckets, fire hooks, and hand-pumped engines. The Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, reportedly hesitated to order the demolition of houses to create fire breaks, fearing lawsuits from property owners. By the time action was taken, the fire had grown into an unstoppable inferno. For 4 days, the Great Fire raged. It consumed St. Paul's Cathedral, hundreds of churches, thousands of homes, and the city's bustling commercial heart. Eyewitness Samuel Pepys described the scene in his diary. It made me weep to see it. Churches, houses, and all on fire and flames running up the hill. The poor pigeons, I perceive, were loath to leave their houses, but hovered about the windows and balconies till some of them burned their wings and fell down. By the time the fire was brought under control, it had destroyed roughly 13,200 houses and left an estimated 70,000 to 80,000 people homeless. For many Londoners, the disaster was proof of divine judgment and the accuracy of prophetic warnings. The number 1666 seemed too perfect, too symbolically loaded to be mere coincidence. Preachers thundered from pulpits that the city's sins had invited God's wrath. However, historians caution that prophecy here was more a matter of interpretation than prediction. Nostradamus' quatrains were notoriously ambiguous, and fears about 1666 had been so widespread that some form of disaster, war, plague, or fire could easily have been claimed as fulfillment. In fact, the Great Plague of 1665, which killed tens of thousands in London, had already been seized upon as partial confirmation of apocalyptic warnings before the fire ever began. The Great Fire reshaped London. It led to new building regulations, including the use of brick and stone instead of timber, and the creation of wider streets to prevent similar catastrophes. Christopher Wren's redesigned St. Paul's Cathedral would become a symbol of resilience. Yet, in popular imagination, the fire remains bound to the prophecies that preceded it. The combination of symbolic timing, catastrophic scale, and pre-existing public anxiety ensured that 1666 would be remembered not only as a year of loss, but as a year in which many believed the heavens had spoken. The rise of Napoleon, the late 18th century, was a time of upheaval in Europe. The French Revolution, 1789-1799, had upended centuries of monarchy, replaced it with a republic, and unleashed waves of political chaos, executions, and wars with nearly every major European power. France itself was a nation searching for stability and perhaps unknowingly for a strong leader who could restore order while preserving the revolution's achievements. In the East, monarchies eyed France with suspicion and hostility. In the West, Britain feared the spread of revolutionary ideals. Against this stormy backdrop, an ambitious young Corsican officer began his meteoric climb. Among the many quatrains of Nostradamus, several were later interpreted as foretelling the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. One of the most often cited appears in Century 8, Quatrain 1, Pau nay, Lorone will be more of fire than blood. To swim in praise, the Great One, to flee to the confluence. He will refuse entry to the magpies. Pampon and durance will keep them confined. The unusual grouping of syllables, pau, ne, loron, was later seen by believers as a cryptic anagram of Napoleon Roy, Napoleon King in French. At the time of writing in the 16th century, Nostradamus could not have known the name of a future French emperor. Skeptics suggest the resemblance is coincidental, while believers see it as intentional code. Another quatrain, Century 1, Quatrain 60, speaks of a leader rising from humble origins in southern Europe to dominate much of the continent, a description that fits Napoleon's Corsican roots and imperial ambitions. Napoleon was born in 1769 on the island of Corsica, recently acquired by France from the Republic of Genoa. His family belonged to the minor nobility, giving him access to education but little wealth. As a young artillery officer, he demonstrated exceptional strategic thinking, particularly during the siege of Toulon in 1793, where his bold tactics helped drive out British forces. His career accelerated with the Italian campaign of 1796-1797, where he defeated Austrian armies and expanded French influence. These victories made him a national hero and, in the eyes of some, the embodiment of the Great One hinted at in prophetic verse. By 1799, France's Directory government was corrupt, unstable, and widely despised. Napoleon returned from his Egyptian expedition and seized the moment. In the coup of 18 Brumaire, he overthrew the Directory, established the consulate, and placed himself as first consul, effectively the ruler of France. 5 years later, in 1804, he crowned himself emperor in Notre Dame Cathedral, signaling both his defiance of tradition and his sense of destiny. For prophecy enthusiasts, this was the transformation of Napoleon into a monarch, just as Nostradamus's cryptic line seemed to suggest. Between 1804 and 1812, Napoleon's armies dominated continental Europe. He redrew borders, dismantled old monarchies, and spread the Napoleonic Code. His campaigns reached from the Iberian Peninsula to the gates of Moscow, altering the political landscape so dramatically that even his eventual defeat could not undo all his reforms. To believers in prophecy, the speed and scope of his rise from obscure Corsican officer to master of Europe in little more than a decade matched the image of a preordained conqueror. Skeptics argue that linking Nostradamus to Napoleon relies heavily on selective interpretation and retroactive reading. The anagram like Pau, Ne, Loron could refer to towns in southern France rather than a name. The Great One could be any powerful leader. Believers counter that the geographic and biographical hints, coupled with the rarity of such a meteoric rise in history, point toward genuine foresight. Napoleon's final years, his disastrous Russian campaign, defeat at Leipzig, exile to Elba, return for the 100 Days, and ultimate downfall at Waterloo were also framed by some as predicted in prophetic literature. Nostradamus wrote of a great one who would be cast down by lightning from on high, which interpreters linked to Napoleon's sudden loss of empire. In 1821, Napoleon died in exile on the remote island of St. Helena. The man who had reshaped Europe in less than 2 decades was gone, but the debate over whether his life had been foretold still lingers. The Oracle of Croesus. In the 6th century BCE, Croesus, king of Lydia, ruled over a wealthy and strategically important kingdom in western Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. His capital, Sardis, was famed for its riches, flowing from control of gold-rich rivers and lucrative trade routes. Croesus was not only powerful but proud. His name became synonymous with opulence. Even today, the phrase rich as Croesus survives in multiple languages. But in the ancient world, wealth and power were precarious. Across the plains to the east, a formidable rival was rising, Cyrus the Great, leader of the Persian Empire. Conflict seemed inevitable, and Croesus, cautious but confident, decided to seek guidance from the most famous spiritual authority of his time, the Oracle of Delphi. The Oracle of Delphi, situated at the Temple of Apollo in Greece, was revered as the voice of the god himself. Kings, generals, and commoners alike made the pilgrimage to consult the Pythia, the priestess who delivered Apollo's messages in trance-like utterances. Her pronouncements were famously ambiguous, a fact that gave them both enduring credibility and notorious interpretive flexibility. By Croesus's time, the oracle's influence extended far beyond Greece. Rulers from distant lands sent gifts to Delphi in hopes of receiving favorable guidance. Croesus, intent on ensuring he received a truthful answer, reportedly tested several oracles with a secret challenge. He asked them to tell him what he was doing at a specific moment. Only the Delphic oracle answered correctly, describing in detail his preparation of a lamb and a tortoise boiled together in a bronze pot. Satisfied with her reliability, Croesus sent lavish offerings to Delphi and posed his most urgent question: should he attack Persia? The oracle's answer was both clear and cryptic. If you cross the Halys River, you will destroy a great empire. To Croesus, this seemed a divine green light. The great empire could only be Persia, and the god appeared to promise its destruction at his hands. Convinced of his destined victory, Croesus mobilized his forces, formed alliances, and advanced toward the Persian frontier. The Halys River, today's Kızılırmak River, marked the traditional boundary between Lydia and Persia. Crossing it in 547 BCE, Croesus engaged Cyrus's forces in battle. The fighting was inconclusive, and Croesus, following the seasonal custom, disbanded his army for the winter, assuming Cyrus would do the same. Cyrus did not. Moving with uncharacteristic speed, the Persian king pursued Croesus back to Sardis, besieged the city, and captured it within 2 weeks. The great empire that had been destroyed was not Persia at all, it was Lydia. The prophecy had been fulfilled, but in a way that Croesus had not imagined. The brilliance or cunning of the Delphic oracle lay in her careful phrasing. She had not said whose empire would fall. This ambiguity ensured that no matter the outcome, her words could be seen as accurate. For believers, this was evidence of divine wisdom, capable of seeing the outcome, even if humans misunderstood it. For skeptics, it was a masterclass in non-committal prediction designed to preserve the oracle's reputation regardless of events. Croesus's misinterpretation of the prophecy became a cautionary tale in ancient literature. Herodotus, who records the story, uses it to illustrate the dangers of overconfidence and the necessity of questioning one's assumptions. The episode also cemented the Delphic oracle's mystique. She had once again spoken the truth, though not in the way her audience had expected. In the centuries since, destroying a great empire has become shorthand for the double-edged nature of prophecy. Even when the words are accurate, human interpretation can turn them into traps. Conclusion: coincidence, calculation, or the hand of fate? From the fall of Babylon to the cryptic warning given to Croesus, these prophecies share certain traits. Vivid imagery. Whether in Isaiah's poetic condemnation of Babylon or Nostradamus's enigmatic quatrains, these predictions are often wrapped in symbolic or metaphorical language. Ambiguity. Many can be interpreted in multiple ways, allowing them to fit events in hindsight. High stakes. They tend to be tied to moments of great political, military, or social crisis, the kinds of events that people naturally seek meaning in. Recorded and retold, these prophecies survive through written accounts, religious texts, or oral tradition, ensuring they could be connected to later events. When we lay the 6 prophecies side by side, 3 categories emerge. Immediate fulfillments, e.g., the destruction of the Second Temple, which followed a specific prediction within a single generation. Long-range fulfillments, e.g., the return of the Jewish people to Israel, which took centuries and required a vast chain of historical events. Ambiguous fulfillments, e.g., Croesus's oracle, where the prophecy was technically correct but depended entirely on the listener's interpretation. This pattern suggests that a prophecy's perceived accuracy depends not only on what is said, but on how and when it is applied. Historians, theologians, and skeptics have long debated whether fulfilled prophecies are evidence of supernatural insight or something more human. The explanations usually fall into one of 4 categories. Divine revelation, the belief that the prophet truly received knowledge from a supernatural source beyond the limits of time. Shrewd observation, the prophet understood political, social, or environmental trends so well that the outcome was foreseeable to a perceptive mind. Self-fulfilling prophecy, the prediction influences human actions in a way that brings about its own fulfillment. Retroactive fitting. The prophecy is vague enough that after an event occurs, it can be interpreted as having predicted it all along. One cannot ignore the human need for meaning, especially in times of disaster or transformation. When the temple burned, when London smoldered, when Napoleon rose from obscurity, people sought patterns that made sense of the chaos. Prophecies offered that pattern a reassurance that events, no matter how disruptive, were part of a larger, perhaps divine design. The stories of these fulfilled prophecies continue to shape culture. Babylon's ruins are a UNESCO heritage site. Jerusalem's Western Wall remains a place of pilgrimage. The Great Fire of London is commemorated in monuments and museums. Napoleon's life is studied in military academies worldwide, and the Oracle of Delphi is still quoted in discussions of political miscalculation. These are not just relics of the past, they influence literature, film, political rhetoric, and even the way modern people talk about future predictions. So, are these prophecies the work of fate, foresight, or coincidence? The honest answer may be that they are a mix. Some could be the product of extraordinary insight, others of artful ambiguity, still others of our tendency to connect dots after the picture has already formed. But perhaps the enduring power of prophecy is not in its accuracy, but in its ability to make us pause and consider the currents of history. Prophecies remind us that the past is not just a sequence of events, it is a tapestry woven with human hopes, fears, and the enduring belief that the future, however uncertain, can sometimes be glimpsed before it arrives. Having traced the arc of these famous prophecies from the deserts of Mesopotamia to the embers of London, from imperial rise to imperial ruin, certain patterns emerge. They are not merely historical curiosities, they are windows into the way humans interpret meaning, especially when it comes to the future. Whether it was Isaiah's vision of Babylon's ruin, the Pythia's riddle to Croesus, or the poetic obscurity of Nostradamus, the prophecies that endure tend to be those that leave room for interpretation. An ambiguous statement allows for flexible application. In Croesus's case, the prophecy was fulfilled precisely because it could be read in two directions. But Nostradamus' cryptic verses survive in popular imagination because they are adaptable, their imagery can be retrofitted to events centuries later. A prophecy often gains credibility when the historical context appears to align naturally with its claims. In the decades leading up to the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, tensions between Jews and Romans made some form of catastrophe likely. In the mid-17th century, the apocalyptic dread of the year 1666 primed Londoners to see any disaster as predicted. Context can make an ordinary prediction feel like an extraordinary insight. People remember the hits and forget the misses. Nostradamus wrote hundreds of quatrains, yet only a fraction are cited as fulfilled. This selective recall reinforces the illusion of accuracy. Similarly, biblical prophecies are often remembered through the lens of later events, with verses reinterpreted to match known history. The more emotionally charged the event, the more potent the prophecy feels in retrospect. The fall of Babylon, the Holocaust, and creation of Israel, the burning of London, these were moments of profound trauma or transformation. Attaching them to ancient words creates a narrative arc that is emotionally satisfying and culturally resonant. Some prophecies may influence the very events they predict. The belief that a certain year, leader, or location is destined for greatness or disaster can shape political and military decisions, nudging reality toward the prophecy's fulfillment. The question at the heart of fulfilled prophecy is deceptively simple. Are these moments truly glimpses of the future, or are they the inevitable byproduct of human pattern making? To answer this, we must look closely at three lenses: statistical probability, historical record, and human psychology. At first glance, some prophecies appear so precise that they seem to defy chance. Nostradamus' year 2066 quatrain and the Great Fire of London, for example, seem tightly matched. Yet probability theory reminds us that with enough vague statements, some will inevitably align with future events. If a person makes 1,000 predictions, a handful will match reality purely by coincidence, and these hits are the ones we remember. In biblical prophecy, the vast time span between writing and fulfillment increases the likelihood of some alignment. Empires rise and fall, cities are destroyed, and exiles return. These are recurring patterns in history. A prediction that a great city will be laid waste will, given centuries, almost certainly come true somewhere. The reliability of the source is crucial. Ancient texts often survive through copying and translation, which can introduce changes intentional or accidental. Sometimes prophecies are recorded after the events. They describe a practice known as vaticinium ex eventu, prophecy from the event. This raises the possibility that certain fulfilled predictions were actually written with hindsight. In the case of Isaiah's prophecy against Babylon, skeptics note that later editors may have shaped the text during or after the city's decline. With Croesus and the Delphic oracle, the account comes to us through Herodotus, writing decades after the events, possibly embellishing details to fit the moral of the story. Humans are meaning makers. We are wired to connect dots, to create narrative coherence from scattered events. This cognitive bias apophenia means we often see intentional design in random patterns. When disaster strikes, we search our cultural memory for stories or predictions that explained it in advance. These matches comfort us, providing the illusion of control over chaos. The desire for meaning is especially strong in times of crisis. The return of Israel after the Holocaust was for many an affirmation that suffering was not in vain, that history was guided by a divine hand. Similarly, Napoleon's contemporaries could frame his career as the outworking of destiny rather than a product of revolutionary upheaval. Why do certain prophecies endure for centuries while others fade into obscurity? The answer lies in a combination of cultural transmission, adaptability, and the human instinct to anchor the present in the wisdom or warnings of the past. For a prophecy to survive, it must be recorded and repeatedly copied. Biblical prophecies were preserved through meticulous scribal traditions, ensuring that verses like Isaiah's warning to Babylon could reach modern readers intact. In the classical world, historians like Herodotus immortalized the oracle at Delphi, giving Croesus's fateful question a permanent place in Western memory. The survival of Nostradamus's Les Prophéties depended on the printing press, which allowed his quatrains to spread widely and remain in circulation for centuries. A prophecy that is too specific may become obsolete after a single fulfillment, but one that is poetic, symbolic, or vague can be revived again and again. Nostradamus's quatrains, for example, have been applied to the Great Fire of London, Napoleon, Hitler, and even events of the 21st century. Biblical prophecies about the return of Israel were cited in the 19th century by early Zionists, in 1948 during Israel's independence, and continue to be referenced in debates about the nation's future. Some prophecies survive because they are woven into the identity of a people. The Jewish hope of return to Zion persisted in religious rituals, songs, and prayers for nearly 2 millennia. For the French, stories of Napoleon's destined rise feed a national mythos of grandeur and resilience. When a prophecy becomes part of a community's cultural DNA, it is passed down not just as history, but as heritage. Historical crises often breathe new life into old prophecies. A war, natural disaster, or political upheaval can send people searching ancient texts for parallels. This reactivation ensures that certain predictions are never truly forgotten. The year 1666 became a focal point for apocalyptic expectation because it could be linked to both biblical symbolism and Nostradamus's words. From the fall of Babylon to the burning of London, from the destruction of the Jerusalem temple to the rebirth of Israel, the stories of prophecy we have traced reveal more than just uncanny alignments between past words and future events. They tell us something profound about ourselves, about how humans navigate uncertainty, how we attach meaning to history, and how we negotiate the tension between fate and free will. In each case, we have examined the core text is only half the story. The other half is the reader, the interpreter, who decides whether a match exists. Isaiah's vision of a desolate Babylon was written in a time of imperial upheaval, but it was later generations living through the city's long decline who declared it fulfilled. The Delphic oracle's warning to Croesus did not change, but its truth shifted entirely with the outcome of battle. Nostradamus's quatrains, shrouded in metaphor, have been made to fit Napoleon, Hitler, and dozens of other figures. We are more likely to see fulfillment in prophecies that speak to our deepest hopes and fears. The Jewish return to Israel resonates so powerfully because it is the restoration of an ancient dream. Napoleon's rise reads like destiny because it unfolded at a moment of revolutionary possibility. The Great Fire of London feels like a fated punishment or cleansing because of the moral anxieties of its time. History shows that skepticism and faith often live side by side. Even in eras dominated by religious belief, there were voices questioning the authenticity of prophetic claims. And in modern secular societies, prophecies still find believers partly because they satisfy a psychological craving for narrative closure, and partly because the boundary between coincidence and design can never be entirely sealed. Prophecy survives because it operates in a space science cannot fully occupy, the realm of meaning. Even if every fulfilled prophecy could be explained by probability, cultural bias, or retroactive editing, the sense that some visions might be genuine, that the future can occasionally cast shadows backward into the past, remains irresistible. In the end, perhaps prophecy's greatest power is not in foretelling events, but in giving them shape once they have happened. It allows societies to weave their chaos into a coherent story, to believe that their struggles and triumphs are part of something larger. Whether this is the hand of fate, the will of God, or the artistry of human storytelling, the result is the same. Prophecy endures and will continue to endure as long as we seek patterns in the tapestry of time